Hi everyone, this is April Forts and I'm the math consultant at the Iowa Department of Education. And this is the February webinar for Principles to Action. In this webinar, we're going to be talking about facilitating meaningful mathematical discourse with students. And so effective teaching of mathematics facilitates discourse among students to build shared understanding of mathematical ideas by analyzing and comparing students' approaches and arguments. There is a whole lot in that statement. When students are doing it well, it's amazing, but it doesn't just happen, and it takes a while to get really good at this. I know it was something that I struggled with in the classroom, and I was always trying to improve my skill set and ability to be able to do it. So we're going to take a look at it and talk about the different components and how we can learn to be better with it. So one of the things that we did, and I'll open up the Padlet, was we described what it looked like in a classroom when the students and teachers are engaging in meaningful mathematical discourse. So what those educators in Iowa were able to do is to jump into this Padlet. And you'll be able to go in also because you'll have the slide deck. And so then you can talk about all the different things that happen when we're doing this. Like students are asking each other questions. Sometimes they get frustrated. They're leading the discussion. There's a lot of movement and talking. It's productive struggle though, right? Because we don't want them to stay up in that frustration. We want them to work through it and be like, well, I don't know what this means. And somebody says, well, I think this. Well, why do you think that? Well, I think it because of this. Well, you didn't think about this, or did you consider this? And I know I'm like little kiddos aren't going to talk like that, but still, if you listen to children talk, they're able to do this, right? And they're just really good at going back and forth. I love to listen to toddlers like argue about something, especially when they're being sweet to each other. But because they're explaining their thinking and the students are sharing and they're learning, and they're not, I like this one too. I like all of them, but I'm just pointing some of them out. The challenging the procedures and practices in a group, right? They're not just sitting there saying, oh, I'm going to do it this way because the teacher told me to do that, and maybe I'm not sure that makes sense in my mind. Now, I'm not saying what the teacher didn't make sense, but maybe the student just hasn't connected that in their mind yet, right? And so we want them to say, hey, wait a minute, I didn't get that at this point, or you had me up until this point. So when we facilitate mathematical discourse, it's really important that we have those good tasks. And we previously talked about those really good tasks that we can use, like the 3-act task and different resources that are on the website, on the Iowa Core website, that promote that reasoning and problem solving, because that is the primary way that they're going to develop that conceptual understanding for meaningful learning of math. We don't want them just to memorize the steps without any conceptual understanding, because I know when I was in the classroom, if they don't make that conceptual understanding before, it's really hard for those little steps or that little mnemonic or that little, so to speak, trick that we teach them to stick with them. Because once they use it and they regurgitate it out on the assessment, it goes right out the window because it's not connected to anything, right? They just put it in their short-term memory for a while and it flies right out, and they can't transfer it to anything else because they only know how to use it when the problem looks this specific way or when it's this certain type of problem. And so when students can learn to articulate and justify their reasoning and provide that rationale, they will become they will have future success in mathematics. And I love this because I think if we can do this, this means we're thinking. And I think this is one of those things that also transcends disciplines, right? We want people to say, hey, wait a minute, what you told me didn't make sense, or hey, what I was going to do in my job is maybe gonna cause me harm if I think about it and I just don't blindly do it, right? And so we want our students, we want our children to have that ability, and that's mathematically thinking. And oftentimes we don't think about it. And when we can get them to think that way and to have those conversations, they're going to have more success overall. Now, again, while this is really important and we want to get there, it does present some challenges. And so some things are, it's how to build and honor on student thinking. And I know that this was something I was so guilty of not doing well in the classroom. And it was actually watching one of um, Graham's 3-act task, and like, what do you notice? And he said, a student might say hairy arm. And before, especially being a secondary teacher, when somebody said something that didn't really jive, I was always focused on getting them back on the topic, right? And so basically what I was doing was I was shutting down that student. I was saying to that student, your answer is silly, is unimportant. Well, how likely are they going to speak up again? They're not, right? Because they're going to feel like she's going to judge me or something like that. And I didn't even realize I was doing it until I heard Graham talk about it. I was like, oh my goodness, now if I could go back and redo that, I would, which we can't. So all we can do is go forward and try to get better, right? And so that's really at the heart of that, is how to honor their thinking, because we don't want to shut them down. This is not about show and tell. And teachers, in order to facilitate that mathematical discourse, and we're going to talk about it on the next slide, but there's specific things a teacher needs to do, and they're very purposeful. So we must decide, what approaches are we going to share, the order, and the questions that will help the students during the summary of the lesson, which is, I think, the most important part of the lesson, because that's when students make a bunch of connections. That's really when we are able to do that. And we don't want it to just be show and tell, like, okay, well, bring up your paper and just tell it. Like, we want it to be purposeful. We want it to go in a certain order. And we're going to talk about the 5 practices next. So these are the 5 practices. Notice that you really want to think about anticipating the student work before the lesson. And the thing about this was difficult for me to do, because I could think about how I knew to solve it, or maybe one other way. Well, there's a ton of student work out on the internet. So you can like look at different samples of student work to get ideas about different things your students are going to do. Do that before class, because then as you're monitoring, you're going to be able to notice those, right? And then you'll be able to select which ones that you're going and how you're going to sequence them. And you really want to have an idea about that sequencing, because otherwise, if you're like, okay, I anticipated it, I picked the right ones, you know, as I'm walking around, I picked the right ones, but now I need to connect to bring it all together, and I don't know what order I'm going to put them in. So that's really important, and it's not easy. It's you know, it takes some skill to be able to do this. So don't be too hard on yourself if right away when you try to start doing this, it doesn't just like poof magically happen. We want students to talk and respond to one another and question one another, have that classroom community centered environment. And it's really where the teacher plays the leading role to assist those students, right? And we want the students to take on those roles, right? We want a student-centered classroom. We want students where they're talking. I mean, they want to talk anyways. Let them. Just give them really great things to talk about, like really great tasks and really great questions. And next month, we're going to talk about those questions. And so let them. I always said to my students, I get you for like maybe 45, 50 minutes a day. Probably in the high school level, this is the only time you're going to directly talk about math. So it's really important that the whole 45 or 50 minutes that you're in here, or 60 if you're so lucky, 60 would be awesome, that we talk about math for that whole time. Here is a chart, and this chart describes kind of the shift and the levels as we're making that shift from the teacher role over to the students having that responsibility for building that classroom environment. And so as you look across here, we start with the teacher's role, and then we go to questioning. And as we move across, this is becoming more and more student action. And then as we go down, it's another shift from teacher to student. So really where we want to be, right, is to end up over here where that the students believe that they are the math leads and can help shape the thinking of others. They help shape others' math thinking in supportive ways and accept the same support from others. So if you do a self-reflection and you say, my teacher role, I'm a 0, and I'm going to try tomorrow in my classroom to do this and get over here, that's probably not a realistic goal. So we really want to start, I would say, okay, well, maybe in your teacher role, start moving across, but then also encouraging yourself to move down, right? And so you want to become more of that facilitator and making those connections, supporting them, facilitating them to make those connections and those different representations, and taking more on that ownership and that leadership. Because like I used to tell my secondary kids, I'm not going to like college and the rest of your life with you. So it can't be because I told you or because I was going to tell you what to think. It has to be because you're making connections and you're able to do that. And students can't do it without practice. And it takes a lot of practice. And it's messy at best at first. And don't be too hard on yourself about that. So here's the chart that's from the principles to action. And this is what our teacher's doing and what our students are doing. And so again, we want the teachers to be that facilitator and to make sure they're making those explicit connections and that we're supporting those mathematical ideas and the different representations. And we want students to really be critical in a positive way of each other's ideas. And I think this really supports the standard of mathematical practice number 3, construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others, which is like my love, because again, it transcends disciplines. If we can teach students to construct viable arguments, what are arguments that they know are true and they have evidence to back them up, and if they can critique the reasoning of others, say, hey, why do you think that? Or can you explain that to me? And, oh, well, I wonder about this. They'll be able to go out and be productive citizens in their world, because that's really what they want, what we want them to do. We always say we want them to be real world problem solvers. Well, guess what? Our kiddos are going to have to solve problems. We don't even know what the world's going to look like in a couple of years because it's changing so fast. We can't possibly prepare them. And one of the best ways that we can prepare them is to prepare them to be mathematical thinkers, right? And communicate and have that mathematical discourse. It's just so important. Can't stress it enough. So then during the small group time, we talked about, what are you seeing most instruction? Where are you seeing it done well? How did the teacher get there? So if you know a classroom teacher that's doing this well, ask them. Say, how did you learn to do this? And then ask them if they'll like maybe talk about it in a PLC or share out with somebody else. And then we talked about how do we get more teachers to do this, right? And so one of the first things is you have to know about it. I didn't know about it for a long time. Like I would just put students in groups and be like, okay, now talk to each other. And they were like, okay. And I'm like, no, about math. And they're like, huh? And so it's not natural for them, not natural for us. And so another thing might be, if you have a video of where students are doing it well, show them that video where they're That way they can see, oh, this is what it looks like. This is what it sounds like. This is what's happening. So to kind of wrap up, this is one of the practices where it's just you have to be really purposeful and really prepared to facilitate the discourse. Until you get really natural and really skilled with it, you can't just show up and do it on the fly unless you're really gifted, and some of you are. Okay, some of you, I know I was not gifted that way in doing this, and so I had to be cognizant of it. I had to work at it. I really had to spend some time thinking about it myself, because we want those students to be those active members around that reasoning. So again, you'll be able to find the resources on the Google site here. And so I'll just open that up there, and you'll be able to go over to here and find your guidebook and the webinar information, which we'll post after I upload this one. Additionally, we put in here a coaching tool. And in this coaching tool, you can, I love when I go into things and I see people and there's always like, yay, somebody's trying to use it. So you can go down here to mathematical discourse, and this tool here you could use to maybe do a coaching observation and say what's the teacher action, what's the student action, and just put that information here if you want to. And then if you click on here, it's going to give you some other resources, and we've linked in the 5 practices framework, and so all that's right there for you. And then lastly, the next webinar will be March 27th. We'll run it at 10 and 4 like we normally do. We'll talk about posing purposeful questions. And even if you didn't attend it live, if you made it all the way to the end, which I know each and every one of you did, then please take a minute and give me some feedback in the survey. I promise I made it quick, but I actually look at every single one of these responses because I do try to get better, because I'm a continuous learner too. And it's one of the reasons why I like to keep this conversation going in Iowa, so we can continue to learn about it, and then we can continue to implement and take it to deeper levels. So thank you, and I hope to see you next month.